The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Buckingham Palace as King Charles III stood at his office window, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. At 75, the weight of the crown had aged him more than the years themselves. The ornate room around him, filled with centuries of royal history, felt suffocating on this particular Tuesday morning in March. Charles had been awake since 4 o'clock, his mind racing with thoughts that had plagued him for months. The decision he was about to make would shake the very foundations of the monarchy and break the heart of the woman who had stood by his side through decades of public scrutiny and private turmoil. Queen Camilla sat in her private sitting room 3 floors below, unaware that her world was about to crumble. She was reading correspondence from various charities, her reading glasses perched delicately on her nose. At 76, she had finally found her place in the royal family after years of being cast as the other woman, the villain in a fairy tale that had captured the world's attention. The palace staff moved through their morning routines with quiet efficiency. Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper who had served the royal family for 37 years, noticed the tension that seemed to permeate the ancient walls. She had witnessed many royal dramas over the decades, but something about today felt different, more final. Charles's private secretary, Sir Malcolm Whitfield, knocked softly on the office door before entering. A tall, distinguished man in his 60s, Sir Malcolm had served Charles for over 15 years and had become one of his most trusted advisors. He carried a leather folder containing documents that Charles had requested the previous evening. "Your Majesty, the papers you requested," Sir Malcolm said, his voice careful and measured. He had been shocked when Charles had asked him to prepare these particular documents, but his years of service had taught him when to question and when to simply obey. Charles turned from the window, his blue eyes reflecting a sadness that seemed to come from deep within his soul. "Thank you, Malcolm. Please sit down." He gestured to the burgundy leather chairs arranged around a small table near the fireplace. The 2 men sat in silence for a moment, the crackling of logs in the fireplace the only sound. Charles had always found comfort in fire. It reminded him of simpler times at Highgrove, his beloved country home, where he could escape the pressures of royal duty. "Sir, if I may," Sir Malcolm began carefully, "are you certain about this course of action? The implications are considerable." Charles leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming against the armrest. "Malcolm, in my 75 years, I have made many decisions. Some wise, some foolish. But this decision, as painful as it is, feels like the first truly honest choice I have made in decades." The story of Charles and Camilla's relationship stretched back over 50 years, a love affair that had survived marriages to other people, public scandals, and the relentless scrutiny of the British press. They had first met at a polo match in 1970, when Charles was 22 and Camilla was 23. The chemistry between them had been immediate and undeniable. But royal duty had intervened, as it so often did. Charles was expected to marry a virgin bride of suitable breeding, and Camilla was considered unsuitable due to her previous relationships. So Charles had been steered away, eventually marrying Lady Diana Spencer in what was billed as the wedding of the century. Meanwhile, Camilla had married Andrew Parker Bowles, a cavalry officer, in 1973. But the connection between Charles and Camilla never truly severed. Through their respective marriages, divorces, and the tragic death of Diana in 1997, they had remained connected by an invisible thread that neither time nor circumstance could break. They had finally married in 2005, a quiet civil ceremony that was a far cry from the pomp and pageantry of Charles's first wedding. Camilla had gradually won over the British public, transforming from the most hated woman in Britain to a respected member of the royal family. When Charles ascended to the throne following his mother's death, Camilla had become queen consort, finally achieving the position that had once seemed impossible. Now, as Charles sat in his office with the documents that would end their marriage, he reflected on the irony of their situation. They had fought so hard to be together, overcome so many obstacles, only for him to realize that their love, while genuine, might not be enough to sustain the future he envisioned for the monarchy. The decision had been building for months. Charles had become increasingly concerned about the monarchy's relevance in the modern world. Public opinion polls showed declining support for the royal family, particularly among younger generations. The cost of maintaining the monarchy during a time of economic hardship had become a source of public debate. Charles felt the weight of history on his shoulders and the need to make radical changes to ensure the institution's survival. His son William, the heir apparent, had been having frank discussions with his father about the future. William represented a new generation of royals who understood the need for significant modernization. These conversations had planted seeds of doubt in Charles's mind about his own role and the choices he had made. The breaking point had come during a private family gathering at Sandringham in January. Charles had watched Camilla interact with his grandchildren, George, Charlotte, and Louis. While she was kind and caring, he could see that she would never be the grandmother figure that Diana might have been. The children were polite but distant, a reminder of the complex legacy of his relationship with Camilla. That evening, Charles had taken a long walk through the estate grounds, his breath forming clouds in the cold winter air. He had always been a man who sought solitude in nature when facing difficult decisions. As he walked past the church where his family had worshipped for generations, he had experienced what he could only describe as a moment of clarity. He realized that his marriage to Camilla, while personally fulfilling, had become a symbol of the monarchy's past rather than its future. The public had largely accepted her, but they had not embraced her with the warmth that the monarchy needed to thrive. Charles began to consider whether his personal happiness was worth the potential damage to the institution he was sworn to serve. The idea of divorcing Camilla had first appeared as just a fleeting thought, quickly dismissed as impossible. But, as the weeks passed, the thought had grown stronger, more insistent. Charles found himself researching the historical precedents, consulting with constitutional experts about the implications of a reigning monarch's divorce. The precedent was not encouraging. No British monarch had ever divorced while on the throne. Charles's own great-great-uncle, Edward VIII, had abdicated in 1936 to marry the divorced Wallis Simpson, creating a constitutional crisis that had scarred the royal family for generations. But Charles was not considering abdication. He was considering something even more unprecedented. His closest advisors had been shocked when he first broached the subject. The Archbishop of Canterbury, spiritual leader of the Church of England of which Charles was the supreme governor, had been particularly troubled. A monarch's divorce would raise serious questions about the Church's teachings on marriage and the royal family's moral authority. But Charles had pressed on, driven by a conviction that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. He had consulted constitutional lawyers, historians, and political advisors. The consensus was that while a monarch's divorce would be legally possible, the political and social ramifications would be enormous. Public opinion would be divided. Some would see it as a necessary modernization of the monarchy, a recognition that even royals should not be trapped in unhappy marriages. Others would view it as a betrayal of traditional values and religious principles. The tabloid press would have a field day, dissecting every aspect of the decision and its aftermath. International implications also weighed heavily on Charles's mind. As head of the Commonwealth, his actions would be scrutinized by 54 member nations, many of which held conservative views on marriage and divorce. The monarchy's role as a symbol of stability and tradition would be challenged. But perhaps most difficult of all was the personal cost. Charles genuinely loved Camilla, despite everything. She had been his confidant, his supporter, his companion through some of the most difficult periods of his life. The thought of hurting her was almost unbearable, yet he had convinced himself that it was necessary for the greater good. As Sir Malcolm sat across from him, Charles opened the leather folder and examined the documents inside. The divorce petition had been carefully prepared by the most discreet legal minds in the country. It cited irreconcilable differences and the need for the monarchy to adapt to contemporary expectations. "The Prime Minister has been informed?" Charles asked, though he knew the answer. "Yes, Your Majesty. The meeting is scheduled for this afternoon. The cabinet has been briefed, though they are struggling with the implications." Charles nodded. The political establishment would need time to digest this unprecedented situation. The government would have to manage the fallout while trying to maintain public confidence in the monarchy as an institution. And the Archbishop? "He has requested a private audience at your earliest convenience. He is deeply concerned about the theological implications." Charles understood the Archbishop's position. The Church of England had been created specifically to allow Henry VIII to divorce and remarry, but that historical precedent offered little comfort in the modern era. The Church now took a more conservative stance on divorce, and for the Supreme Governor to divorce his wife would create a theological crisis. The irony was not lost on Charles. His ancestor had broken with Rome to divorce his wife. Now Charles was considering divorce while remaining within the church he led. The circular nature of royal history seemed almost cosmic in its implications. As the morning progressed, Charles found his resolve wavering. The weight of his decision pressed down on him like a physical force. He thought of Camilla, probably still reading her correspondence, unaware that her husband was about to destroy their life together. He remembered their wedding day in Windsor, the joy in her eyes as they were finally able to publicly declare their love. He thought of their quiet evenings at Highgrove, working in the garden together, sharing the simple domestic happiness that had eluded them for so many years. But then he thought of his duty, his responsibility to the crown and the British people. The monarchy was bigger than any individual, bigger than any personal relationship. His mother had understood this, sacrificing personal happiness for duty throughout her 70-year reign. Perhaps it was time for him to make a similar sacrifice. The documents in the folders seemed to mock him with their official seals and legal language. Once signed, they would set in motion a process that could not be undone. The divorce would take months to finalize, but the moment he signed the papers, there would be no turning back. Charles closed the folder and looked at Sir Malcolm. "How long do I have before the lawyers need a decision?" "They require your signature by the end of the week, Your Majesty. After that, the legal proceedings will begin, and confidentiality will become increasingly difficult to maintain." Charles stood and walked back to the window. Outside, tourists were gathering for the changing of the guard, their cameras ready to capture a piece of royal pageantry. They had no idea that inside the palace, their king was contemplating a decision that would change the monarchy forever. The weight of centuries pressed down on him. Every monarch who had come before had faced difficult choices, but few had faced one with such personal and institutional implications. Charles felt the loneliness of leadership more acutely than ever before. In her sitting room below, Queen Camilla finished her morning correspondence and checked her schedule. She had a charity luncheon to attend that afternoon, followed by a reception for Commonwealth diplomats. These events, once daunting, had become routine parts of her royal duties. She thought about Charles, wondering if he was feeling better. He had seemed distant lately, preoccupied with matters he didn't share with her. She attributed it to the pressures of his new role as king, the adjustment period that everyone said was natural. Camilla had no idea that upstairs, her husband was holding papers that would end their marriage. She had no idea that by the end of the week, her world would be turned upside down once again. She continued with her morning routine, trusting in the love that had sustained them through 5 decades of trials. The palace continued its ancient rhythms around them, unaware that history was about to take another dramatic turn. In the kitchen, staff prepared lunch. In the gardens, groundskeepers tended to the spring flowers. In the offices, courtiers managed the daily business of the monarchy. But in the king's study, Charles sat with the power to change everything in his hands, wrestling with a decision that would define not only his reign but his legacy. The man who had waited 73 years to become king was about to make the most difficult choice of his life, one that would echo through the corridors of power and the pages of history for generations to come. The morning wore on, each minute bringing him closer to a moment of truth that would change everything. The documents lay before him like a bridge to an uncertain future, and Charles knew that soon he would have to decide whether to cross it. The afternoon brought an unseasonable chill to London as King Charles made his way through the palace corridors to meet with Prime Minister James Morrison. The meeting had been arranged with unusual secrecy, scheduled during a gap in both men's public appearances. Charles carried himself with the dignity befitting his position, but those who knew him well might have noticed the slight tremor in his hands and the deeper lines around his eyes. Prime Minister Morrison was already waiting in the blue drawing room when Charles arrived. A career politician in his mid-50s, Morrison had been dealing with economic crises and social unrest since taking office 8 months earlier. He had developed a working relationship with the new king, but nothing could have prepared him for what Charles was about to reveal. "Prime Minister." Charles greeted him formally, though his voice carried an undertone of weariness that Morrison immediately detected. "Your Majesty," Morrison replied, standing and bowing slightly. As they settled into chairs arranged near the ornate fireplace, Morrison sensed the gravity of whatever had prompted this urgent meeting. Charles wasted no time on pleasantries. "James, what I am about to tell you will remain between us until I decide otherwise. I am considering divorcing Queen Camilla." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Morrison's face went pale, and, for a moment, he seemed unable to speak. In his years of political experience, dealing with scandals, crises, and unexpected developments, nothing had prepared him for this moment. "Your Majesty, are you certain?" Morrison finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Charles had rehearsed this conversation in his mind dozens of times, but, sitting across from the Prime Minister, he felt the full weight of what he was proposing. I have given this considerable thought over several months. I believe it is necessary for the future of the monarchy. Morrison leaned forward in his chair, his mind racing through the immediate implications. Sir, the constitutional ramifications alone, we would be in uncharted territory. There are questions of succession, the role of Parliament, public confidence in the government. I am aware of the complexities, Charles interrupted gently but firmly. That is why I needed to inform you personally before proceeding. Your government will need time to prepare for the announcement and its aftermath. The Prime Minister stood and began pacing, a habit he had developed during times of extreme stress. Your Majesty, may I ask what has led you to this decision? The Queen Consort has been, well, she has been generally well received by the public in recent years. Charles had anticipated this question, but answering it required him to articulate feelings and convictions that were deeply personal, yet had far-reaching public implications. The monarchy must evolve to remain relevant, James. My marriage to Camilla, while personally meaningful, represents the past rather than the future. The institution requires a fresh start. Morrison stopped pacing and faced the king directly. Sir, with respect, the public has largely accepted Queen Camilla. Divorce could be seen as, well, as destabilizing rather than modernizing. Perhaps, Charles acknowledged. But sometimes leadership requires making unpopular decisions for the greater good. I have spent my entire life preparing for this role, and I will not allow personal considerations to compromise the monarchy's future. As they continued their discussion, Queen Camilla was attending her charity luncheon across town. The event was being held at the Savoy Hotel, supporting literacy programs for disadvantaged children. She moved through the crowd with practiced grace, engaging with donors and beneficiaries with the warmth that had gradually endeared her to the British public. Lady Margaret Thornberry, one of Camilla's oldest friends and a frequent companion at royal events, noticed something different about the Queen Consort that afternoon. You seem a bit distant, dear, she whispered during a quiet moment between speeches. Camilla forced a smile. Just tired, Margaret. Charles has been working very hard lately, and I suppose it affects us all. But the truth was more complex than simple fatigue. Camilla had been sensing something in Charles for weeks now, a withdrawal that went beyond the normal pressures of kingship. Their conversations had become more formal, less intimate. He seemed to be creating distance between them, though she couldn't understand why. During their marriage, they had always been able to talk through difficulties. Charles valued her opinion and often sought her counsel on matters both personal and official. But, lately, he had been making decisions without consulting her, handling correspondence privately, and spending long hours alone in his study. The previous evening, she had tried to broach the subject. Charles, is everything all right? You seem troubled lately. He had looked up from his papers with an expression she couldn't read. Just the weight of responsibility, my dear. Nothing that concerns you directly. The phrase, nothing that concerns you directly, had stayed with her all night. Everything about Charles's role as king concerned her directly. She was his wife, his queen consort, his partner in the duties of monarchy. The suggestion that there were aspects of his kingship that didn't involve her felt like a subtle rejection. Back at Buckingham Palace, the meeting between Charles and the Prime Minister was drawing to a close. Morrison had asked dozens of questions about timing, process, and implications. The constitutional lawyers would need to work overtime to navigate the unprecedented legal territory. When do you plan to inform Queen Camilla? Morrison asked, dreading the answer. Charles's composure wavered for the first time during their meeting. Tonight. I wanted to ensure you were prepared before I destroyed her world. The raw emotion in the king's voice reminded Morrison that beneath the constitutional crisis and political implications, this was a man about to end his marriage to a woman he genuinely loved. The human cost of royal duty had never been more apparent. Your Majesty, if I may, have you considered the possibility of counseling, or perhaps taking time to reconsider? Once this becomes public knowledge, there will be no going back. Charles appreciated Morrison's concern, but his decision felt inevitable now. I have considered every alternative, James. This is the right course of action, even if it is the most painful one. As evening approached, Camilla returned to the palace from her charitable engagements. She was pleased with how the luncheon had gone. The literacy program would receive significant new funding. These small victories in her royal duties had become increasingly important to her sense of purpose and achievement. She found Charles in his study, sitting in the same chair where he had spent much of the day wrestling with his conscience. The divorce papers lay in the leather folder on his desk, still unsigned but representing a decision that felt increasingly final. "How was your day, darling?" Camilla asked, settling into the chair across from him. She had changed from her formal day dress into more comfortable evening wear, a simple cashmere sweater and skirt that Charles had always said brought out the color of her eyes. "Productive," Charles replied, though his voice lacked its usual warmth. "And yours?" "The literacy luncheon went wonderfully. We raised nearly £200,000. Camilla studied her husband's face, noting the tension around his eyes and the way he avoided meeting her gaze directly. They sat in silence for a moment, the familiar comfort of their shared space feeling somehow strained. Camilla had always been able to read Charles's moods, but tonight felt different, more ominous. "Charles, we need to talk," she said finally, her voice gentle but firm. The words he had dreaded all day had finally come. Charles looked at his wife, this woman who had been his companion through so much joy and sorrow, and felt his heart breaking. "Yes, I suppose we do." Camilla sensed the gravity in his tone and felt a chill of apprehension. "Whatever it is, we can work through it together. We always have." The reference to their history of overcoming obstacles together made Charles's task even more difficult. They had indeed weathered many storms, but this was different. This was not a problem to be solved together. It was a decision he had made alone. "Camilla, what I have to tell you will be difficult to hear," Charles began, his voice barely steady. She leaned forward in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You're frightening me, Charles." "What is it?" The words came out in a rush, as if saying them quickly would somehow lessen their impact. "I have decided to file for divorce." The silence that followed was deafening. Camilla stared at her husband with an expression of such shock and disbelief that Charles had to look away. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "I am filing for divorce, Camilla. The papers are being prepared." The words hit her like a physical blow. Camilla felt the world tilting around her, as if the solid ground beneath her feet had suddenly given way. "I don't understand." "Charles, we were happy. Aren't we happy?" The pain in her voice cut through Charles like a knife. "Camilla, please understand, this is not about our personal happiness. This is about the monarchy, about duty, about the future of the institution." "The institution?" Camilla's voice rose slightly, emotion breaking through her initial shock. "Charles, I am part of this institution. I am your wife, your queen consort. I have spent years building my role, earning public acceptance. And you have done magnificently," Charles interrupted. "But I have come to believe that our marriage, our history, represents the past rather than the future the monarchy needs." Camilla stood abruptly, moving to the window as if needing to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the room. Outside, the palace gardens were shrouded in darkness, but she stared into the night as if seeking answers in the shadows. "This is about Diana, isn't it?" she said quietly, her back still turned to him. "It's always been about Diana." Charles felt a surge of frustration mixed with guilt. "This has nothing to do with Diana. This is about the monarchy's survival in the modern world." Camilla turned to face him, and Charles saw tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Don't lie to me, Charles. Not after everything we've been through. You think divorcing me will somehow cleanse the monarchy of our past, make William and Kate the fresh start you believe the institution needs." The accuracy of her assessment was painful. Charles had indeed considered how his divorce would position William and Catherine as the future of the monarchy, unburdened by the complicated history that surrounded Charles and Camilla's relationship. "The public has accepted me, Charles," Camilla continued, her voice growing stronger despite her tears. "The press that once vilified me now treats me with respect. I have found my place in this family, in this role. How can you ask me to give that up?" "I am not asking," Charles said quietly. "I am telling you what I have decided." The finality in his voice broke something inside Camilla. The tears that had been threatening now flowed freely down her cheeks. "After everything we've sacrificed, everything we've endured to be together, you're willing to throw it all away for an institution that has already cost us so much." Charles wanted to go to her, to comfort her, but he forced himself to remain seated. Physical comfort would only make this more difficult for both of them. "I know this seems cruel, Camilla, but sometimes leadership requires making choices that hurt the people we love most." "Leadership?" Camilla's voice cracked with emotion. "Is that what you call this? Abandoning your wife for the sake of public opinion polls and political calculation?" "The monarchy is bigger than both of us," Charles replied, falling back on the rationale he had rehearsed. My duty to the crown must come before personal considerations. Camilla wiped her tears with the back of her hand, trying to regain some composure. Your mother managed to balance personal happiness with royal duty. She never asked Philip to sacrifice their marriage for the sake of the institution. My mother lived in a different time, Charles said. The challenges facing the monarchy today are unlike anything she had to deal with. So you're willing to sacrifice our marriage on the altar of modernization? Camilla's voice was bitter now, hurt transforming into anger. How very progressive of you, Charles. The sarcasm in her voice stung, but Charles pressed on. The decision has been made, Camilla. The Prime Minister has been informed, and the legal proceedings will begin next week. The revelation that others already knew about his decision while she had been kept in the dark was another blow. You told the Prime Minister before you told me? Your own wife learned about her divorce from you as an afterthought. Charles realized how callous that must seem, but it had been necessary to prepare the government for the constitutional implications. I needed to ensure the proper procedures were in place. The proper procedures, Camilla repeated flatly. How wonderfully royal of you to ensure the paperwork was in order before destroying your wife's life. She moved toward the door, then stopped, and turned back to face him one last time. You know what the truly tragic part is, Charles? I actually believed we had found our happy ending. After all those years of hiding, of being called the other woman, of watching you marry Diana while knowing you loved me, I thought we had finally won. Camilla, please. No, she said firmly, holding up her hand to stop him. I believed in us, Charles. I believed in what we had built together. But, apparently, your crown means more to you than your wife. With that, she left the room, closing the door quietly behind her. Charles sat alone in his study, surrounded by the symbols of royal power and authority, feeling more isolated than he had ever felt in his life. Down the hall, Camilla walked slowly toward their shared apartments, her mind reeling from the conversation. The palace corridors, once familiar and comforting, now felt foreign and cold. Staff members bowed respectfully as she passed, unaware that they might be witnessing one of her last walks through the palace as queen consort. In her private sitting room, Camilla collapsed into her favorite chair and allowed herself to cry freely for the first time since Charles had delivered his devastating news. The sobs that racked her body seemed to come from a place of grief so deep she wasn't sure she would ever recover. Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper, was passing in the corridor when she heard the unmistakable sound of someone in profound distress. She paused outside Queen Camilla's door, torn between her desire to offer comfort and her professional obligation to respect royal privacy. After a moment's hesitation, she knocked softly. Your Majesty? Is everything all right? The crying stopped abruptly. After a moment, Camilla's voice came through the door, carefully controlled despite her emotional state. I'm fine, Mrs. Henderson. Just a bit tired. Mrs. Henderson had heard enough royal heartbreak over the years to recognize it, but she respected Camilla's need for privacy. Very well, Your Majesty. If you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to call. As the housekeeper's footsteps faded down the corridor, Camilla was left alone with her grief and the ruins of her marriage. Outside her window, London continued its evening rhythm, unaware that the monarchy was about to face its greatest crisis since the abdication of Edward VIII nearly a century earlier. The palace that had once represented the fulfillment of her dreams now felt like a beautiful prison from which she would soon be exiled. The crown that she had worn with such pride would be taken from her, leaving her to face an uncertain future alone. In his study, Charles signed the divorce papers with a heavy heart, knowing that he had just changed the course of history and broken the heart of the woman he loved. The decision was made, and there would be no turning back. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, matching the somber mood that had settled over Buckingham Palace like a heavy blanket. Queen Camilla had barely slept, spending most of the night staring at the ceiling of what had been their shared bedroom. Charles had not come to bed at all, choosing instead to spend the night in his study, surrounded by the papers that would legally end their marriage. Camilla's lady-in-waiting, Sarah Matthews, noticed immediately that something was terribly wrong when she arrived for the Queen Consort's morning briefing. Sarah had served in various royal households for 20 years and had developed an intuitive sense for the emotional undercurrents that flowed through palace life. Your Majesty, you look pale this morning. Are you feeling unwell? Sarah asked with genuine concern as she reviewed the day's schedule. Camilla sat at her dressing table, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed to have aged years overnight. Her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, and her usual composed expression had been replaced by one of profound sadness. "I'm quite all right, Sarah," Camilla replied automatically, though her voice lacked its usual warmth. "What do we have today?" Sarah consulted her folder, though she was still studying her mistress with worried eyes. The garden party committee meeting at 10, lunch with the patron saints of various charities at 1, and the Commonwealth reception this evening. The mention of the Commonwealth reception made Camilla's heart sink. It would be one of the largest social events of the season, with diplomats and dignitaries from across the realm in attendance. The thought of having to smile and make small talk while her world was crumbling seemed almost impossible. "Cancel the morning meeting," Camilla said quietly. "Tell them I'm indisposed. We'll keep the lunch and see about the evening." Sarah was surprised. Queen Camilla rarely canceled engagements, priding herself on her reliability and dedication to her duties. "Shall I call the palace physician, Your Majesty?" "That won't be necessary," Camilla said, finally, turning away from the mirror. "I just need some time to think." Meanwhile, 3 floors up, King Charles was meeting with his constitutional advisors in the formal council chamber. The room was filled with some of the most distinguished legal minds in the kingdom, all struggling to come to terms with the unprecedented situation their monarch had presented them. Sir Geoffrey Blackstone, the Lord Chancellor, was reviewing a thick stack of legal precedents and constitutional documents. As the highest legal authority in the land after the monarch himself, Sir Geoffrey bore the responsibility of ensuring that any royal divorce proceeded within the bounds of law and tradition. "Your Majesty, I must be frank," Sir Geoffrey began, his voice grave. "What you are proposing has never been attempted by a reigning monarch. The legal framework exists, but the constitutional implications are staggering." Charles sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his hands folded before him. He had requested this meeting to understand exactly what he was setting in motion, though his resolve remained unchanged. "Explain the process to me, Geoffrey." "The divorce proceedings themselves would be relatively straightforward," Sir Geoffrey continued. "However, the Queen Consort's constitutional status complicates matters significantly. She is not merely your wife. She is a recognized part of the constitutional monarchy." Lord Hamilton, the Archbishop of Canterbury's representative, interjected with obvious discomfort. "Your Majesty, there are also serious theological considerations. As Supreme Governor of the Church of England, your divorce raises questions about the Church's stance on marriage that have not been addressed since Henry VIII. Charles had anticipated this objection. "The Church has evolved its position on divorce over the centuries. Even my brother divorced and remarried within the Church." "Yes, sir, but Prince Andrew was not the monarch," Lord Hamilton replied respectfully. "Your position as head of the Church creates unique complications that require careful consideration." The discussion continued for over 2 hours, with various advisors raising concerns about everything from the line of succession to international relations. Each point reinforced the magnitude of what Charles was attempting, but also his determination to see it through. Sir Malcolm Whitfield had been quietly taking notes throughout the meeting. As Charles's private secretary, he would be responsible for managing the practical aspects of the announcement and its aftermath. The logistics alone were daunting. "Your Majesty," Sir Malcolm said when the legal discussion concluded, "we need to consider the timing and method of the public announcement. The Palace Press Office is requesting guidance on how to proceed." Charles had been dreading this aspect of the decision. Once the news became public, there would be no privacy, no quiet moments to process the end of his marriage. Every detail would be dissected by the media and the public. "I want to speak to William first," Charles said. "He needs to hear this from me personally before it becomes public knowledge." The mention of Prince William brought another layer of complexity to the situation. As heir apparent, William would be directly affected by any changes to the monarchy's structure and public perception. His reaction could influence public opinion significantly. "I'll arrange a private meeting for this afternoon," Sir Malcolm confirmed. "What about the Queen Consort? How do you wish to handle her public appearances while the proceedings are pending?" The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Charles realized that he hadn't fully considered how Camilla would navigate her remaining royal duties while their marriage was being dissolved. The practical cruelties of his decision were becoming increasingly apparent. "She should continue her scheduled appearances for now," Charles said after a long pause. "When the announcement is made, she can decide how she wishes to proceed." What Charles didn't realize was that Camilla had already begun making her own decisions about how to handle the impossible situation. After dismissing Sarah, she had called her son Tom Parker Bowles and her daughter Laura Lopez, asking them to come to the palace immediately. Tom arrived first, finding his stepfather's wife in a state unlike anything he had seen since the dark days following Diana's death. Camilla had always been a strong woman, capable of weathering public criticism and personal attacks with grace and dignity. But this was different. This was devastation from within her own marriage. "Mama, what's happened?" Tom asked, using the informal name he had called her since childhood. Camilla broke down again as she tried to explain Charles's decision. The words seemed impossible to say aloud, as if speaking them would make them more real. "He's divorcing me, Tom. After everything we've been through, he's chosen his crown over our marriage." Tom was speechless. Like most people, he had assumed that Charles and Camilla's marriage was unshakable, forged by decades of shared trials and genuine love. The idea that Charles would voluntarily end their union seemed impossible. "There must be some mistake," Tom said finally. "Perhaps he's just struggling with the pressures of being king. Maybe if you talk to him again." "No," Camilla said firmly, wiping her tears with a handkerchief that bore the royal cipher. "He's made his decision. The papers are already being prepared. He told the Prime Minister before he told me." The bitterness in her voice revealed the depth of her hurt. Tom had never heard his stepmother speak with such pain about the man she loved. Laura arrived shortly after, and Camilla had to repeat the devastating news. Both of her children were shocked and angry, unable to understand how Charles could treat their mother so callously after everything she had sacrificed for their relationship. "What will you do?" Laura asked, holding her mother's hand. "I honestly don't know," Camilla admitted. "I've built my entire adult life around Charles and this role. Without them, I'm not sure who I am anymore." The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Sarah Matthews entered cautiously, clearly uncomfortable with interrupting what was obviously a private family moment. "Your Majesty, I'm terribly sorry, but the committee chairman for the garden party is asking if you'll be available for a brief telephone conference instead of the canceled meeting. They have some urgent decisions that require your input." Camilla looked at her children, then back at Sarah. The normal world was continuing around them, expecting her to fulfill her royal duties even as her personal world collapsed. The garden party was scheduled for the following week, and hundreds of guests were depending on it proceeding smoothly. "Tell them I'll call in an hour," Camilla said. She turned to Tom and Laura. "I need to maintain some normalcy while I figure out what comes next." Her children exchanged worried glances. They could see their mother struggling to hold herself together, trying to maintain the dignity and composure that had become second nature during her years as a royal spouse. Across the palace, Charles was beginning his meeting with Prince William. Father and son had always had a complex relationship, marked by periods of closeness and distance. William had initially been resistant to Camilla's role in their family, but over the years, he had come to respect her dedication to his father and her service to the monarchy. "Father, Sir Malcolm said you needed to speak with me urgently," William said as he entered the king's study. Charles gestured for his son to sit down, noting how much William resembled his mother at times. The thought of Diana brought a pang of guilt about what he was about to reveal. "William, what I'm about to tell you will come as a shock," Charles began. "I have decided to divorce Camilla." William's reaction was immediate and intense. His face went pale, and he leaned forward in his chair as if he hadn't heard correctly. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "I am ending my marriage to Camilla," Charles repeated. "The decision has been made, and the legal proceedings will begin shortly." William stood and began pacing, much as the Prime Minister had done the day before. "Father, this is unprecedented. Why? Is there some problem I'm not aware of?" Charles explained his reasoning about the monarchy's need for modernization and his belief that their marriage represented the past rather than the future. William listened with growing disbelief and concern. "Father, Camilla has been nothing but loyal to this family and the institution," William said when Charles finished. "She's earned the public's respect and acceptance. How can you throw that away?" "Sometimes leadership requires making difficult sacrifices," Charles replied, using the same justification he had given everyone else. "Difficult sacrifices?" William's voice rose slightly. "Father, this isn't a sacrifice for the good of the monarchy. This is you destroying a good marriage for reasons I don't understand." The criticism from his son hit Charles harder than he had expected. William's opinion mattered to him greatly, both as his heir and as someone who understood the pressures of royal life. "The decision has been made, William," Charles said firmly. "I need your support during the transition period." "My support?" William shook his head in disbelief. "Father, I can't support something I fundamentally disagree with." Camilla has been a stabilizing influence on you and a positive presence in this family. This decision seems arbitrary and cruel. Charles felt his carefully constructed justifications beginning to crumble under his son's scrutiny. William's reaction forced him to confront the possibility that his decision might be wrong, but he had gone too far to turn back now. William, I understand your concerns, but this is bigger than any individual relationship. The monarchy must evolve to survive. By destroying the relationships that actually work, William countered. Father, Catherine, and I have built our public roles partly on the foundation that Camilla helped establish. You're not just divorcing your wife. You're undermining everything she's accomplished. The meeting ended without resolution, with William leaving clearly distressed, and Charles feeling more isolated than ever. He had expected resistance from various quarters, but his son's opposition was particularly painful. As evening approached, the Commonwealth reception proceeded as scheduled. Camilla had decided to attend, reasoning that maintaining her duties was the only way to preserve her dignity during the crisis. She dressed carefully in a navy blue evening gown with the diamonds that Charles had given her for their 5th wedding anniversary. The reception was held in the palace's grandest ballroom, with representatives from across the Commonwealth realm in attendance. Camilla moved through the crowd with practiced grace, making conversation with diplomats and their spouses as if nothing had changed. But those who knew her well could see the strain beneath the surface. Her smile seemed forced, her laughter too bright, her conversation slightly distant. Lady Margaret Thornberry, watching from across the room, knew something was seriously wrong. Charles arrived at the reception an hour after it began, having spent additional time in meetings with his advisors. When he entered the ballroom, conversation briefly paused as guests acknowledged the king's presence. His eyes immediately sought out Camilla, finding her near the windows overlooking the palace gardens. For a moment, they looked at each other across the crowded room. The distance between them seemed symbolic of the gulf that had opened in their relationship. Camilla's expression was unreadable, but Charles could see the pain she was trying so hard to hide. Throughout the evening, they moved through their roles as king and queen consort with professional competence, but they never spoke to each other directly. Guests who didn't know about the brewing crisis saw nothing unusual, but the palace staff noticed the careful distance the royal couple maintained. As the reception wound down, Camilla excused herself early, claiming fatigue. She walked slowly through the palace corridors toward her apartments, knowing that each step might be bringing her closer to the end of her life as queen. In her sitting room, she found a handwritten note that had been delivered during the evening. It was from Charles, brief and formal, informing her that the divorce announcement would be made public within the week and advising her to prepare accordingly. The coldly official tone of the note was the final blow. After 50 years of love letters, intimate conversations, and shared dreams, their marriage would end with legal documents and formal notifications. Camilla crumpled the note and threw it into the fireplace, watching as the flames consumed what felt like the last remnant of their relationship. Outside her window, London sparkled in the darkness, unaware that one of the greatest love stories in royal history was ending not with passion or drama, but with the quiet destruction of two hearts that had once beat as one. The palace that had witnessed their triumph would soon witness their downfall, and the monarchy would face its greatest test in generations. The woman who had fought so hard to become queen was about to lose everything, while the man who had sacrificed so much for duty was discovering that some prices are too high to pay, even for a crown. The announcement came on a Thursday morning at precisely 10 o'clock. The palace press office had spent days crafting the statement, each word carefully chosen to minimize damage while acknowledging the unprecedented nature of the situation. Sir Malcolm Whitfield stood at the podium in the palace press room, facing a crowd of journalists who had been summoned for what they were told would be a significant announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sir Malcolm began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal, "I have been asked to read the following statement on behalf of His Majesty the King." The room fell silent, photographers adjusting their equipment and reporters preparing to transcribe what they sensed would be historic words. It is with deep regret that His Majesty King Charles III announces his intention to seek a dissolution of his marriage to Queen Consort Camilla. This decision has been made after careful consideration of the evolving needs of the monarchy in the modern era. Both parties have agreed to proceed with dignity and mutual respect. Her Majesty Queen Camilla will retain her titles and privileges during the transition period. There will be no further comment on this matter at this time. The silence that followed the announcement lasted only seconds before the press room erupted into chaos. Journalists shouted questions, cameras flashed incessantly, and the sound of phones ringing filled the air as news organizations scrambled to break the story to the world. Within minutes, the news was spreading across social media platforms. Television networks were interrupting regular programming, and newspaper editors were hastily rewriting front pages. The hashtag royal divorce began trending worldwide within the hour. Queen Camilla was in her private sitting room when the announcement was made, having chosen to remain secluded rather than face the immediate aftermath. She sat in her favorite chair, the same one where she had received so many pieces of good news over the years, and watched the coverage on television with a mixture of disbelief and profound sadness. The BBC's royal correspondent was providing breathless commentary about the constitutional implications while footage of Charles and Camilla's wedding played in the background. Seeing those images of their happiest day, when they had finally been able to publicly declare their love, was almost unbearable. Her phone had been ringing continuously, but she had instructed her staff not to put any calls through except from her immediate family. Tom and Laura had both called within minutes of the announcement, offering to come to the palace immediately, but Camilla had told them she needed time alone to process what was happening. The reactions from around the world were swift and varied. The Archbishop of Canterbury released a statement expressing his concern about the theological implications while pledging to work with all parties involved. The Prime Minister held an emergency press conference, assuring the public that the government remained confident in the monarchy as an institution despite this unprecedented development. International news outlets were having a field day. American television networks were running hour-long specials about the divorce, while European newspapers were comparing it to the abdication crisis of 1936. Royal biographers and constitutional experts were being rushed into television studios to provide analysis of a situation none of them had ever imagined. Public opinion was sharply divided. Younger generations seemed more understanding of the king's decision, viewing it as evidence that even royals should not be trapped in unwanted marriages. However, older citizens and traditional monarchists were outraged, seeing it as a betrayal of the institution's values and a personal cruelty toward Queen Camilla. Social media was particularly brutal. Hashtags supporting both sides of the controversy trended simultaneously, with hashtag Team Camilla and hashtag Team Charles becoming rallying points for opposing viewpoints. Memes and commentary flooded platforms, much of it highly critical of Charles's decision. Prince William and Catherine were inundated with requests for comment, but they maintained strict silence on their father's decision. William had made it clear to his own staff that he would not publicly criticize his father, despite his private disagreements with the divorce. At Clarence House, which had been Charles and Camilla's London residence before they moved to Buckingham Palace, staff were quietly packing belongings and preparing for Camilla's eventual return. The house that had been their sanctuary for so many years would now become her refuge from the storm surrounding the divorce. Charles himself remained largely invisible during the first day of coverage, staying within his private apartments at the palace and conducting only essential business. He had expected the media frenzy, but the intensity of the reaction was overwhelming even for someone who had lived his entire life in the public eye. His private secretary brought him hourly updates on the coverage and public reaction. The polls showed that while a slight majority supported his right to divorce, approval of his handling of the situation was much lower. Many people felt that Camilla had been treated unfairly and that the announcement had been unnecessarily cold and impersonal. "Your Majesty," Sir Malcolm said during one of their briefings, "there are calls for you to make a personal statement explaining your decision. The current narrative is quite critical of your treatment of Queen Camilla." Charles had anticipated this request, but dreaded the thought of having to publicly justify his personal decisions. What kind of statement are they expecting? "Something more personal than the formal announcement," Sir Malcolm replied carefully. "The public wants to understand your reasoning beyond constitutional considerations." The suggestion made Charles uncomfortable. He had always been a private person, reluctant to share his innermost thoughts with the world. The idea of explaining his feelings about his marriage to millions of strangers felt like a violation of everything he held sacred. "I'll consider it," Charles said, though he had no intention of providing the kind of personal revelation the media was demanding. Meanwhile, Camilla was facing her own pressure to make a statement. Her longtime friend and unofficial spokesperson, Lady Margaret Thornberry, had been fielding calls from journalists around the world, all seeking Camilla's perspective on the divorce. They want to know how you're feeling, what your plans are, whether you'll fight the divorce, Margaret explained during a private meeting at the palace. Camilla looked exhausted, the strain of the past few days evident in her appearance. I won't dignify this with a public statement, Margaret. I won't give them the satisfaction of seeing me grovel or beg. But, darling, your silence is being interpreted as acceptance, even approval of Charles's decision, Margaret pointed out. Some people are saying you must have agreed to this privately. The suggestion that she had willingly participated in her own public humiliation sparked the first real anger Camilla had shown since the crisis began. Let them think what they want. I won't play their games or feed their appetite for royal drama. But, privately, Camilla was struggling with whether to break her silence. She had received hundreds of letters of support from around the world, many from women who saw her situation as emblematic of broader issues about marriage, loyalty, and women's treatment by powerful men. One letter, from an elderly woman in Wales, particularly moved her. Your Majesty, you have shown us all how to conduct ourselves with dignity in impossible circumstances. Please know that many of us see the injustice in how you are being treated and admire your strength. The outpouring of support was unexpected and deeply touching, but it also highlighted the impossible position Charles had placed her in. She was receiving sympathy as a victim, but maintaining her dignity meant she couldn't acknowledge that role publicly. The second day after the announcement brought new developments. The church where Charles and Camilla had married issued a statement expressing sadness about the divorce and reaffirming their belief in the sanctity of marriage. Several Commonwealth leaders requested private conversations with Charles to understand the implications for their relationship with the crown. More troubling for Charles was the reaction from his own family. Prince Harry released a statement from California expressing support for Camilla and describing her as a steadying influence on the royal family. Princess and Charles's sister was reportedly furious about his treatment of Camilla, though she maintained public silence. The most damaging criticism came from an unexpected source. Queen Elizabeth's former private secretary, Lord Chamberlain Sir Christopher Hartwell, gave an interview to the Times suggesting that the late Queen would have been deeply troubled by her son's decision to divorce during his reign. Her Majesty always believed that personal sacrifice for the sake of duty was the highest calling of a monarch, Sir Christopher said. She would have struggled to understand prioritizing institutional concerns over personal loyalty and commitment. The interview created another media firestorm and forced Charles to confront the possibility that he was betraying not only his wife, but also his mother's example and expectations. The weight of disappointing the woman who had devoted her life to the monarchy was almost unbearable. By the end of the week, protests had begun outside Buckingham Palace. Small groups of demonstrators carried signs supporting Camilla and criticizing Charles's decision. Camilla is our queen, and divorce is not the answer were common slogans, along with more personal attacks on Charles's character. The protests were largely peaceful, but they represented something unprecedented in Charles's experience. Throughout his life, public criticism had been directed at his actions or policies, but this felt more personal, more damning. The protesters weren't just disagreeing with a royal decision. They were judging his character as a man and a husband. Inside the palace, the staff was struggling with divided loyalties. Many had worked with Camilla for years and had come to respect and even love her. Watching her suffer while maintaining her dignity was heartbreaking for those who knew her personally. Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper, found herself in an impossible position. She had served the royal family faithfully for decades, but she was finding it difficult to maintain her professional neutrality. When she encountered Camilla in the corridors, the Queen Consort's obvious pain was evident despite her attempts to maintain composure. Your Majesty, is there anything I can do to help during this difficult time? Mrs. Henderson asked during one encounter. Camilla paused, surprised by the direct offer of support. Palace staff typically maintained strict professional boundaries, but the extraordinary circumstances seemed to have suspended normal protocols. Thank you, Mrs. Henderson, Camilla replied softly. Your kindness means more than you know. The brief exchange was witnessed by several other staff members and quickly spread through the palace's informal communication network. The consensus among the staff was overwhelmingly sympathetic to Camilla and critical of Charles's handling of the situation. This undercurrent of staff displeasure added another layer of stress to Charles's already difficult position. The palace had always functioned on loyalty and respect for the monarch, but Charles was discovering that those qualities could not be commanded when they conflicted with personal conscience and human decency. As the first week after the announcement drew to a close, Charles found himself increasingly isolated within his own home. The building that represented the pinnacle of his achievement had become a prison of his own making, filled with reproachful looks and awkward silences. Late one evening, he encountered Camilla in the portrait gallery, where she was looking at a painting of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, perhaps the most famous royal love story in British history. They stood in awkward silence for several minutes before Charles finally spoke. "Camilla, I want you to know that this decision was not made lightly," he said quietly. She turned to look at him, and he was shocked by how much weight she seemed to have lost in just 1 week. The stress was taking a visible toll on her health and appearance. "I know you believe you're doing what's right, Charles," she replied, her voice devoid of emotion. "But that doesn't make it any less devastating for those of us who believed in what we had built together." It was the first time they had spoken since the night he told her about his decision, and the distance between them felt vast and unbridgeable. Charles wanted to reach out to her, to somehow explain or justify his actions, but the words wouldn't come. "The lawyers need to meet with you next week to discuss the financial arrangements," he said finally, hating himself for the clinical nature of the conversation. "Of course they do," Camilla replied bitterly. "Because reducing our marriage to a financial transaction is exactly what this situation needed." She walked away without another word, leaving Charles alone with the portraits of his ancestors, many of whom had faced their own crises of duty and personal desire. But none had chosen quite this path, and none had paid quite this price. The palace around them continued its ancient rhythms, but everyone within its walls knew that something fundamental had changed. The monarchy that had survived wars, scandals, and social upheaval was facing perhaps its greatest test, and the outcome remained uncertain. Outside, London continued its busy life, but the conversation in pubs, offices, and homes increasingly centered on the royal divorce and what it meant for the future of the institution. The fairy tale that had taken 50 years to write was ending, and no one knew what story would replace it. 3 months after the announcement, the divorce proceedings had become a grinding, painful process that dominated every aspect of life at Buckingham Palace. The legal machinery that Charles had set in motion proved to be far more complex and emotionally devastating than anyone had anticipated. What he had envisioned as a clean, dignified separation had devolved into a public spectacle that damaged both the monarchy and the people involved. Queen Camilla had moved back to Clarence House permanently, though she retained her title and continued with selected royal duties. The arrangement felt surreal to everyone involved. She would arrive at the palace for official functions, perform her role with professional competence, and then return to what had once been their shared home, now feeling like exile. The media coverage had not diminished with time. If anything, it had intensified. Every court filing, every legal document, every procedural step was dissected by journalists and royal watchers. The British public, initially divided on the divorce, was increasingly turning against Charles as the human cost of his decision became apparent. A particularly damaging poll published in the Sunday Times showed that public approval of King Charles had dropped to 31%, the lowest rating ever recorded for a reigning monarch. More troubling for the institution, support for the monarchy itself had declined to 48%, dangerously close to minority status for the first time in modern history. Prince William had been forced to take on an increasingly public role in defending the monarchy as an institution while carefully avoiding any direct support for his father's personal decisions. His position was impossibly delicate, trying to maintain family loyalty while preserving his own future as king. During a visit to a children's hospital in Manchester, William was confronted by protesters holding signs reading, "Save Queen Camilla" and "Charles the Cruel." The images of the future king walking past such displays were broadcast around the world, symbolizing the damage the divorce was inflicting on the entire royal family. "Your Royal Highness, what do you say to people who think your father is treating Camilla unfairly?" a reporter shouted during the hospital visit. William paused at his car door, his face reflecting the strain he had been under for months. "I believe in the strength and importance of the monarchy as an institution," he said carefully. "My focus remains on serving the British people and supporting the causes I believe in." The non-answer satisfied no one and further highlighted the impossible position the entire family found themselves in. Catherine, walking beside her husband, appeared equally uncomfortable with the constant questions about the divorce that overshadowed every public appearance. Back at Clarence's house, Camilla was struggling with depression that grew worse with each passing week. The woman who had once been known for her resilience and sense of humor seemed to be fading before the eyes of those who cared about her. Her children, Tom and Laura, had become increasingly worried about her mental and physical health. "Mama, you can't go on like this," Laura said during one of her daily visits. "You've lost weight, you're barely sleeping, and you're isolating yourself from everyone who cares about you." Camilla sat in the drawing room that she had once shared with Charles, surrounded by photographs and mementos of their life together. She hadn't had the heart to put them away, even though seeing them was a constant source of pain. "What would you have me do, Laura?" Camilla asked, her voice hollow. "Pretend this isn't happening? Pretend that the man I loved for 50 years didn't decide I was expendable?" The bitterness in her voice was a new development, replacing the initial shock and sadness. Camilla had always been remarkably free of resentment, even during the worst years of public hatred. But this betrayal from within her own marriage had awakened an anger that seemed to be consuming her from within. Tom had been urging his mother to fight the divorce more aggressively, to use the media attention to tell her side of the story. "You don't have to just accept this, Mama. You have rights, and you have support from the public." "And what would that accomplish?" Camilla replied. "Turning this into an even more public spectacle? Destroying what's left of the monarchy to satisfy my wounded pride." Her unwillingness to fight back publicly was both admirable and frustrating to those who loved her. Even in her pain, she was putting the institution's welfare above her own interests, something that made Charles's treatment of her seem even more inexcusable. The legal proceedings themselves had revealed uncomfortable truths about the financial arrangements of the royal marriage. Details about Camilla's lack of independent wealth and her dependence on Charles's support had emerged during property negotiations, painting a picture of a woman who had given up her own financial security for love. Charles's lawyers had been surprisingly generous in their settlement offers, perhaps reflecting his own guilt about the situation. Camilla would receive a substantial financial package that would ensure her comfort for the rest of her life, along with the continued use of certain royal properties. But money could not repair the damage to her reputation or her heart. The most painful aspect of the divorce for Camilla was the way it had affected her relationships within the royal family. She had worked so hard to build genuine connections with Charles's sons and their families, only to see those relationships become casualties of the divorce. Her relationship with William and Catherine had become awkward and strained. While they remained cordial during necessary interactions, the warmth and affection that had developed over the years had been replaced by uncomfortable formality. Camilla understood their position, but couldn't help feeling abandoned by people she had come to love as family. Prince Harry's public support had been appreciated, but also complicated matters further. His statement from California criticizing his father's decision had created additional tension within the family and given ammunition to Charles's critics. Harry's own troubled relationship with his father meant that his support came with its own baggage. The impact on Charles himself had been equally devastating, though he was more successful at hiding it from public view. The man who had waited his entire life to be king was discovering that the crown could be a heavy burden when worn alone. The isolation he felt was profound and growing worse with each passing day. His relationship with his staff had deteriorated significantly. Many longtime employees, particularly those who had worked closely with Camilla, were struggling to maintain their professional loyalty to a king whose personal decisions they found morally reprehensible. The palace, once a place of shared purpose and dedication, had become a workplace divided by conflicting loyalties. Sir Malcolm Whitfield, Charles's private secretary and one of his most trusted advisors, had submitted his resignation the previous month. The official reason was a desire to spend more time with family, but everyone understood the real motivation. Sir Malcolm's departure was seen as a significant rebuke to Charles's leadership and judgment. "Your Majesty, I can no longer in good conscience advise you on matters that I fundamentally disagree with," Sir Malcolm had said during their final private meeting. "My resignation is not just about the divorce. It's about what this decision says about your priorities and your character." The loss of Sir Malcolm was both professionally and personally devastating for Charles. He had relied on the man's counsel for over 15 years, and his departure left a void that went far beyond administrative efficiency. It was a signal that even Charles's closest advisors had limits to their loyalty. The Archbishop of Canterbury had also requested a private audience, though his concerns were more theological than personal. The Church of England was struggling with the implications of having a divorced supreme governor, and there were calls from conservative elements for Charles to step down from his religious role. Your Majesty, the Church is facing serious questions about its teachings on marriage and divorce, the Archbishop explained during their meeting. Your position as supreme governor, while divorced, creates theological contradictions that are difficult to reconcile. Charles had anticipated this challenge, but was unprepared for the depth of the Church's concern. My personal circumstances do not affect my ability to serve as head of the Church, he argued, though his voice lacked conviction. I'm afraid many within the Church disagree. The Archbishop replied gently but firmly. There are calls for you to consider whether continuing in this role serves the Church's best interests. The suggestion that he might need to abandon his role as head of the Church was another blow to Charles's vision of his reign. He had planned significant reforms to modernize the Church of England, but those plans were now in jeopardy because of his personal decisions. Public opinion continued to deteriorate as more details about the divorce emerged. A particularly damaging story in The Guardian revealed that Charles had begun making plans for the divorce before ever discussing his concerns with Camilla. The article painted a picture of a man who had made a unilateral decision about his marriage without considering his wife's feelings or rights. The revelation that Camilla had been completely blindsided by the divorce decision sparked a new wave of public sympathy for her and criticism of Charles. Demonstrations outside Buckingham Palace grew larger and more frequent, with protesters calling for Charles to abdicate in favor of William. Charles the Cruel had become a popular hashtag on social media, accompanied by images comparing him unfavorably to King Henry VIII. The historical parallel was particularly damaging, suggesting that Charles was repeating the worst excesses of royal history rather than modernizing the monarchy. International reaction had also been overwhelmingly negative. Commonwealth leaders expressed private concerns about the stability of the monarchy, with some questioning whether Charles could effectively serve as head of the Commonwealth while dealing with such personal turmoil. The President of France, in an unguarded moment caught on microphone, was heard referring to Charles as a man who cannot manage his own marriage trying to lead a nation. The comment, while not intended for public consumption, accurately reflected the international view of the situation. As autumn approached, the divorce was nearing its final stages. The legal framework had been established, the financial arrangements agreed upon, and the constitutional questions largely resolved. But the human cost continued to mount with each passing day. Camilla made one of her final public appearances as Queen Consort at a charity gala for literacy programs, one of the causes she had championed throughout her royal career. The event was bittersweet, a celebration of the work she had done while serving as a reminder of what she was about to lose. Her speech that evening was brief but poignant. Literacy has the power to transform lives and open doors to opportunity, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion visible in her eyes. It has been my privilege to support this cause, and I hope my work has made some small difference in the lives of those we serve. The standing ovation she received lasted nearly 5 minutes, a spontaneous expression of respect and sympathy from an audience that understood they were witnessing the end of an era. Many in the crowd were crying openly, moved by the dignity with which she was handling an impossible situation. Charles watched the coverage of the event from his study at Buckingham Palace, the same room where he had made the decision that led to this moment. Seeing Camilla's grace and composure in the face of such personal destruction was almost unbearable. For the first time since beginning the divorce proceedings, he allowed himself to question whether he had made the right choice. The final decree was scheduled to be issued the following week, officially ending their marriage and Camilla's role as queen consort. As that moment approached, Charles found himself reflecting on the price he had paid for what he had convinced himself was necessary for the monarchy's future. The institution he had sought to protect was more damaged than ever. His own reputation was in ruins, and he had destroyed the woman who had loved him unconditionally for half a century. The crown he had sacrificed everything to serve felt heavier than ever, and the kingdom he ruled seemed increasingly divided and disillusioned. In her final week as queen consort, Camilla received thousands of letters from around the world, many from women who saw her story as emblematic of broader patterns of betrayal and abandonment. Her grace in defeat had made her a symbol of dignity in the face of injustice, a role she had never sought but wore with characteristic composure. The fairy tale that had begun with a chance meeting at a polo match 50 years earlier was ending in divorce courts and legal documents. But Perhaps the most tragic aspect of the story was that in trying to save the monarchy, Charles had revealed its fundamental weaknesses and contradictions more clearly than any Republican critic ever could. As the final signatures were applied to the decree dissolving their marriage, both Charles and Camilla found themselves alone in ways they had never imagined, casualties of a decision that had satisfied no one and solved nothing. The crown had been preserved, but at a cost that would echo through the corridors of power for generations to come.